Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reagan Shields Ives, and as Elizabeth indicated, I am co-chair with her on the this year's Honors and Awards Committee. And I'm extremely happy today to introduce Parke MacDowell, who is the recipient of the 2021 Flansburgh Award. Parke is a senior associate and fabrication manager at Payette. He works to combine his skills as an architect and his background in construction, and is committed to embedding fabrication within his architectural practice. Through the use of models, prototypes, and full-scale mock-ups, he's able to convey more clearly how design provides solutions for particular programmatic challenges. Parke uses design as a powerful outreach tool to engage the community to participate in design and the construction process. So last year, the Honors and Awards Committee consisting of myself, Elizabeth, Mimi Love, Raquel Davey, David Eisen, and Sam Lasky, reviewed a number of strong Flansburgh Award submissions, but found that Parke's really rose to the top. And I want to share with you a few of the committee comments. One being that, great story with evidence of his interest and passion for fabrication across a broad spectrum of scales, urban design to granular details. His commitment to advancing fabrication strategies and interest in this level of research and development within an architectural practice is commendable. We recognized his personal projects as well as professional work examples, which helped us to connect the dots of his areas of focus and interest. And we commend his dedication to engaging the community and interest in sharing his knowledge in this area of expertise. So I want to welcome Parke to the conversation. And before we dive into his exciting presentation today, want to hear a little bit from Parke as to why he decided to submit an application to the Flansburgh Award in hopes of encouraging others to do the same for this year's award submission. So welcome, Parke.
Thank you, Reagan. Thank you, Elizabeth. And it's actually really affirming to see so many collaborators, past and present, in the room today. Thank you each for being here and for being part of the shared story. I feel like I'm among friends. But the Flansburgh Award, so it's been on my radar since back in 2014 when it started. And I remember watching Stephanie Horowitz receive the award at the BSA Gala that year. And I was thinking, I like what that stands for, which is young architects doing excellent design work that has a meaningful impact on the profession and on the broader world. This aligns with my aspirations. So the timing worked well with the submission relative to the projects I completed and other awards submissions. But the thing that I really value about that process, the collecting and preparing for something like this, is that it forces you to curate your own professional experience and your work and the way you think about your work. And I'll speak about that a little more during the presentation. But one thing I would recommend to potential applicants for this award is to hone your story and refine that personal message. What is it that you do? Why do you do it? And perhaps most importantly, how does it manifest in your work, and what are the implications? So thank you very much for this opportunity. With that, should I dive straight in and start sharing my screen and begin, or have we more to say? Okay, then I'll do just that.
Right in.
Well, then here we are. I'm going to start a bit about where I'm coming from. So at Payette, our primary work focuses on big, complex laboratory and healthcare buildings, but more generally, we recognize the importance of engaging and contributing in meaningful ways to the communities where we live and we work. And we believe that good design is inherently a collaborative process. It should not be exclusive to those entities with deep pockets. And I say this because this worldview is important to me. Architecture, making, and the power of shared agency. I should define that last one before we move on from this slide. What I mean by shared agency is working together toward a broad common vision, but while still retaining autonomy and individual priority structures, which is what encourages individual contributions. And though it requires one to relinquish total control, which is an illusion anyway, what you get in return is a far more robust process and a better end product. It's a more durable result, really, which lasts beyond the tenure of the original authors. Now, I'm going to speak a lot about making things today, but while I am interested in tools and craft, I am most interested in this approach because it has proven to be an incredibly potent way to expand architectural agency, to empower our design process, and to communicate it more effectively. And ultimately, this should be our aspiration as architects. We do not build buildings. We conceive and communicate design ideas, and making things can help us do that better. And that leads to the agenda for this presentation. But before I get into that, if you'd indulge me, I want to challenge you each with a prompt. What is your role in a story that is bigger than you? How might you take your interests and your experience and your aspirations and compose them into a coherent narrative? And then how do you take that narrative, which is about you, and find a place for it in the broader world? What is your role in a story bigger than you? And I say this because, well, it's twofold, really. One, because I find it a helpful device for understanding myself and for making decisions about how to invest my energy. And two, I think Earl Flansburgh, whether consciously or not, did this very well, specifically in the way he positioned himself as a vehicle of positive change within our profession, which you see continue even in his legacy. So now in that vein, if I was to try and put my professional narrative in a single sentence, which is reductive, but I think it can be an asset, that sentence might be something like, I use fabrication to expand architectural agency, to foster shared authorship, and to position my collaborators for success. And over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll show you what I mean by that. I'll start by using a selection of projects to connect the dots from my graduate school exploration to recent forays through my work at NADA and various independent collaborations to my role at Payette and to my broader aspirations for architecture. Now, this work is from 10 years ago when I was in grad school, and my wife and I made a pavilion out of bent steel rod. And it was large, a footprint of about 20 by 30 feet with a height up to 14 feet. And its form was developed using scripting, as well as the choreography, which was developed using scripting for the 7-axis robot and the bending tool that we built to shape the rods. Each of these uniquely shaped rods was broken into segments of lines and arcs, and then this geometry was parsed into movement commands for the robot and the bender. And now this work is from last year. And you can see the parallels with the earlier project. The facade sculpture that you see here marks the entry to an apartment building and a courtyard garden on Amsterdam Avenue in Manhattan. And we fabricated it in the shop, and then swung it into place as a single piece. Now, this was a collaboration with Smith & Co. Architects out of New York City and Concentric Fabrication. And I believe some of these folks are on the call now, but outside of my job at Payette, I do this kind of independent work with fellow designers, with builders, and private clients, particularly on projects with complex detailing, novel geometry. My inclination to strategically collapse this conventional gap between the designer and the builder, it provides fruitful territory for innovation and added value for all parties. You see some of that process here, everything from shop drawings to the bending tools to the installation on site. And now this screen captured video shows how I took that organic geometry of the sculpture and parsed it into simple fabrication instructions. I separated the unique curved pieces and ran a script, which I wrote to identify the line segments and the arcs that make up each piece, and then export that to a cut list, an Excel spreadsheet, and also annotate the 3D model to include the orientation of each segment relative to its neighbors, which aids with assembly. This kind of network design process is very much in the spirit of how we work at Payette and also at NADA, where I worked for several years right after grad school. I owe a great debt to Nader and to Arthur and Katie and the rest of my colleagues there at NADA for shaping me into the architect I am today. And you can see I crafted a position for myself there, as well as at Payette, that didn't really exist previously at the firm. And that was mostly about reclaiming for the architect some of that territory occupied by the builder, that is actually physically executing our ideas. And in Nana, we did design build work for commercial spaces and custom furniture for private clients, in addition to prototyping and material explorations. And we also made a lot of really exquisite models, which were rarely strictly representational. They instead used abstraction to foreground the architectural priorities of the different projects. Here you see models for 2 residential projects, as well as a section model for the University of Toronto School of Architecture, which I'll actually talk more about the warped ceiling you see in that section in just a minute. Both the fabrication experience and the computational design came into play with this work at the University of Melbourne School of Design. This is a project that NADA did with John Wardle Architects, and it supports a built pedagogy where tectonic and programmatic relationships are expressed in an exaggerated way to encourage academic dialogue. What you see here is the suspended studio, we called it, which hangs like this distended coffer in the center of the atrium. And it's actually really important for the acoustics of the space, both in its geometry and in the scripted perforations that you see in the image on the left. The exterior of the building is similarly didactic, that is kind of about teaching. Each of the 4 elevations of the building is doing something different. So the corners where these faces connect become an expressive representation of the dialogue between these different actors. And it's those vignettes that I documented in this drawing. And you see it play out in the actual building. You see the southeast corner shown here, where 2 of these different faces collide at the intersection. Previously, I showed that section model of the Toronto project, the School of Architecture. This project was a really important affirmation for me of the value of having in-house fabrication capabilities in an architecture firm. We had this exuberant warped ceiling, and it had skylights in it. It really dominated the expression of the upper level studio, which was one big room. And it was in danger of being cut from the project because it looked unconventional, and the builder had priced it with the expectation that it would require custom architectural framework and specialty plastering. But by making a full-scale mock-up, we showed that this hyperbolic paraboloid shape could actually be made with straight metal studs and conventional drywall detailing. And this was huge. It reduced the price. The contractor rebid it and reduced their cost by 50%. And this overall key design feature remained in the project. Here you see the full-scale mock-up that we made in our basement shop there. And here's the same approach deployed at full scale on site. And now the finished result. It's an incredibly powerful way to retain architectural agency. And that kind of approach, it adds value at any scale. If we can embolden ourselves as architects to consider the means and methods as part of the design process, we can do incredible things. I'm not saying we should own the means and methods contractually. Usually we definitely should not do that because it's not under our control, but we should own the means and methods intellectually, in dialogue with the builder. This is how we win design authority. You see in these images a few smaller collaborations with other architects in Boston and New York City, like ZH Architects and Chad Smith. On these projects, I was the metals fabricator and a design consultant to the architect, contracted directly with the owner. This was a recent furniture installation with Mark Carriega. And by intellectually owning the means and methods, we were able to wed the geometry with the fabrication constraints and the logistics of installation to produce a really successful project. And when I am both the architect of record and the specialty metals fabricator, this effect is magnified. This was a renovation project for a client in the North End whose kids go to school with my kids. Their apartment was the top 3 stories of the 6-story building. And the top 2 stories actually were an unpermitted addition from the early 80s, and it was plopped on top of a 100-year-old tenement building. And that addition was their primary living space, but it was cramped and closed and inconsistent with the way they aspired to live. So we reconfigured the vertical circulation. We made it more efficient. We opened it up to the city and the sky and had a bit of fun with it. It was an ideal client and an ideal scenario where they invested in thoughtful design early in the process. They locked in decisions and then allowed construction to proceed linearly without any significant changes. So this section shows the thick poche of that original roof and the stacked stairs, which was part of our renovation. It led to a huge operable skylight in the roof deck. Then you see also the rock wall and the climbing net and the folding glass doors that open to the street along the 5th floor frontage. This is a lot of steel for a residential project, but it had some curious loads. And the structural engineer for this project was Becker, which became Thornton Tomasetti partway through. And you can see what the implications were. The builder, Konya, did a great job executing this work as well as the overall scope. And then Jedi and Sun Engineering did the MEP and the HVAC. It was a great team. This plan shows the 5th floor. It's a single open space for the kitchen, the dining, and the living room. All the odd angles of the existing condition were both a challenge and an opportunity for this project. There wasn't a right angle in either plan or section. And here you see the 6th floor. It's a continuation of that stair. And on that whole wall where the stair lies, there's hidden storage. This plan also shows the climbing net open to below. And finally, the 6th floor, or the roof rather. And we actually did this really carefully to avoid any need for zoning variances. We didn't want to go through that protracted process, and we had a very tight budget, which is why, though we had a traditional design, bid, build, procurement process, I ended up taking on the key specialty features myself. And that's the climbing net detailing and the custom stair. Because I'd already figured out how to build that stair and the net in the process of doing the architectural drawings, I could underbid any of the specialty metal subs and still maintain healthy margins. You can see these drawings in front of you. They were actually pulled directly from the bid set and the permit set. So it was highly resolved. And so we built it. And you see that process unfolding here. We went from a detailed 3D fabrication model in Rhino to the cut and bend files, which I sent to the material supplier. And then we installed it on site with great speed and accuracy. Here you can see us cutting threads in the bottom right image in the top of the rods, so we could tension those cables on the far side, or the 3/8 rod on the far side of the stair. Also the clean detailing of that robustly engineered climbing net, from which you can look 6 stories down to Hanover Street. And then some images of the completed stair to the roof deck at the conclusion of the project. If you look carefully, you can see the hidden storage wall behind it. And actually the winders that are shown here were a late breaking addition of the project with the accommodation of some unforeseen structural conditions. But even though it wasn't in the original design, it became one of my favorite details. And I kind of relish it, even as a little lesson. When things go awry, it really lets us show what we can do. And so this was one of those opportunities. You see here on the 5th floor, the stair floats above this low cabinet, and the thickness of that sloping wall, as you saw in the section, accommodates the reading nook. Here in the kitchen, the counter space is subtracted out of this volume of the full height millwork. I used my children as the models for these photos, and they didn't want to leave. But regardless of whether it's the design of an object or a small residential project or a large academic or medical campus, I'm really just deploying the same bag of tricks. I'm inspired by the discovery and the cultivation of relationships, whether it's the intricacies of a connection detail or civic scale social choreography, arranging shapes, composing a project team. For me, this is the essence of design, the manipulation of these relationships, the crafting of these relationships. So at Payette, We do these big complex buildings, design problems that are so tricky that they defy the idea of singular authorship. One person simply cannot possess all of the expertise necessary to execute this work well. And so for us designers, this prompt really becomes, how might we leverage shared authorship, that is many voices feeling a sense of ownership, to better navigate a complex set of constraints and priorities? And this is a philosophy we take not just internal to the office, but also externally with our clients and consultants and the builders. All of these voices together expand the definition of the design problem. We're not just designing the building or the artifact, we're designing the structures by which we approach that problem. And as a result of that, our buildings are not united by a common aesthetic necessarily, but they are united by a common ideology. And it's rooted in the reconciliation of key drivers like program and place and people and performance. The buildings look like what they need to look like in order to do what they need to do. And one way that we've codified this approach in the last several years is through a group that we call Engine. And it isn't a discrete set of people. Instead, it's a constellation of tools and processes and individuals with specific expertise. But it's not just about specialists either. It's instead about this ethos that permeates all facets of the office. It's like everyone is part of this process. Our building science group works side by side with our designers to ensure we're consistently forging new ground on issues of technical performance, sustainability, responsible design. And in the process, we educate and empower all of our staff to develop their own expertise. And in so doing, we're able to deliver an architecture that is more formally exuberant, more delightful from the experiential side, because its aesthetics are underpinned by this rigorous analysis, like this research tower and a conference center in China. It's actually under construction right now in a brand new science city. And the solar veil that you see around this conference center, it was an area of particular focus for me, both in the development of the geometry, as well as in the communication of the core design priorities and the tectonic logic to our collaborators overseas in China. I'm actually going to work on this right after this presentation. We're developing a mock-up to show how they can build these custom curving sunshades. Every one of them is a unique shape, but I think we can build it all efficiently out of flat laser cut parts. So that's what we'll prove later this week. In-house fabrication, it's become a defining aspect of our design process and who we are at Payette over like the last 5-10 years. This is something that's really burgeoned and it continues to evolve. For us, in-house fabrication is not about tools and equipment. It's about positioning our agility and our energy for maximum effect in the face of what are inevitably evolving aspirations and opportunities. That's why we're here. That's why we're making the models and the mock-ups, the prototypes, the furniture. This is the process we want to support. We make things to support those broader priorities. How do we make both our architecture and our design process itself more engaging, more thoughtful, and more beautiful? What I'm going through here now are snips from our fabrication reports. Each of these squares representing a month. So 2 months per slide here. My role is really, it's about crafting a curriculum and a culture that enables and channels this energy. We've got a model shop in the middle of our studio where I am, just across the hall from where I am now. And then we also have a fab lab, a rough space where we've got our CNC router and our welding equipment. Here in the office, we've got our laser cutters and 3D printers and the rest. And we make these models and mock-ups and prototypes, and increasingly we're doing furniture installations as well. Within our larger projects, this is a growing priority and something you'll continue to see if you stay tuned in the next couple of years. And while I've got a dedicated staff of designer fabricators who do things like operate the CNC, the bulk of the making happens within the core project teams. Here, for example, is a typical set of artifacts that might come out of a single project at Payette. An interior mock-up for the space planning and finishes, study models, full-scale facade mock-ups, section models to communicate key building systems. making clarifies ideas, and clear ideas enable decisions, and decisions move projects forward. This process is central to our workflow. It's now central on all of our projects because it works. Models and mock-ups help all parties understand the problem and have a voice in its resolution. And earlier I mentioned about strategically collapsing this gap between the builder and the designer, providing extra value by recognizing both the constraints and the opportunities best known by the architect, or sorry, the constraints and the opportunities of the fabrication process, best known by the builder. And then the aspirations and the client needs, which are best understood by the architect. So if you meld these two together, you're able to deliver more of each, and that's where you really get success. And then finally, looking forward, fabrication can provide this really engaging entry point for underrepresented demographics into the profession. And so with this mindset, I've done a collection of youth-focused workshops where we were building that day, but really we were building for the future. Some examples of how this process plays out on our projects. Early in the design of a Veterans Affairs soldiers' home, we built a full-scale mock-up of a residence room. And that was so we could solicit feedback from the users, including nursing staff and patients and the facilities team, feedback that we might not be able to get via a typical process, sharing drawing sets and images. And this was a full-scale mock-up that we built in the basement of the existing building. And then we supplemented the experience with augmented reality, which allowed us to apply materials to that white box by looking into a device. And the whole experience was really a powerful way to position the client as co-author. This ties back into the way I titled this presentation. We use a similar set of techniques to support our geometric explorations as well. Here you see some early mock-ups and the completed project. There is a readily discernible relationship between our process and our executed work. Both the human and the formal implications of this approach are evident in this massive hospital that we're doing in Changsha, China. We just completed this model at the end of last week, actually. It's a straightforward partie diagram, really, but that's the armature for an intricately sited project. There's immense complexity in both its internal organization as well as its integration of a natural landscape into a web of infrastructure. And this model, which slices a section through the landscape between the two hospital masses, it conveys the spirit of those negotiations. Now, a defining feature of our winning competition entry, this was a competition that we won actually for this project. It's this window box that both humanizes the patient experience and supports the energy performance requirements of the building. It provides daylight and views and natural ventilation, but the exterior cowls of these windows, the cowls, the kind of hoods, the shading devices, they were at risk of being value engineered out of the project. So we made a mock-up. We made this to better communicate our design priorities, and we fabricated it in our shop, and we assembled it in the office. You can see on the right here the evolution of the design from the initial concept to the mock-up. And we made this mock-up actually in preface to a visit from a large contingent of our Chinese collaborators. And even though few of them spoke English and only 2 of our team spoke Mandarin, when they saw the mock-up, they immediately understood what we were trying to do. And so the feature made it into the project. This is another project under construction right now. Over 2,500 of these window boxes with custom angles in response to solar orientation. We won design agency because we communicated effectively through fabrication. This will be familiar to some in the audience. Like I said, many friends. So on this project, it's the pedestrian crossing. The bridge specifically was one in which I had a key stake. And it's another project where in-house mock-ups led to elevated value and an example of how the strategic collapsing of the divide between architect builder allowed us to win design authorship when otherwise we would have lost it. So the bridge crosses over 5 rail lines to connect the main campus to the growing science and engineering complex to the south. And we began with drawings and more exquisite models. And we delivered something incredible. Working over the railway tracks, it's expensive and challenging. Logistically, it's just, a whole series of headaches, but erection must be done swiftly and safely. So our approach was to fabricate as much as possible in the shop, assemble the remaining elements in the laydown yard adjacent to the site, and drop the primary spans in place overnight. In these structural assemblies, they were fabricated in Texas by a group called King Fab, shipped to Boston for on-site assembly and installation by Atlantic Bridge. Skanska was the GC, Eric did the engineering, Stimson the landscape design, Hill International was the owner's project manager, and we had a whole contingent of regulatory agencies and rail agencies and other key supporting players who had a stake in the success of the project. These panels of weathering steels, they stretched up to 20 feet tall, culminating in the kind of gateway feature on the science campus. And then they swoop across the track with this scripted shingle geometry, providing a dynamic experience, which is canyon-like when going from the south to north. And as you go north to south, instead, it fans open as you go this other direction, exposing views to the new science building, as well as downtown Boston. And this view shows the energetic trajectory of that bridge and the panels as they morph across its length. But it almost wasn't as good as it ended up being. Specifically, when that bridge approaches the main campus, one side becomes diaphanous, increasingly transparent. You can see our perforation pattern from the bid set in these mock-ups. And these mock-ups showed us that the pattern that we had selected had actually reinforced the gaps from the secondary stiffeners. And we had hoped to suppress these gaps in the pattern. We wanted to read as a continuous field. So at the 11th hour, we said, stop, we can do better. And we did. We developed a pattern which hid the stiffeners within this field of perforations. This image is from the shop down in Texas, where we listened to the fabricator and we got more of what we wanted by acknowledging their expertise, especially on this piece, which was conically rolled with overlapping plates. It really came out well, far better than it ever could have been if we'd said, no, this is the way we designed it. Let's not even talk about it. So that was a great lesson as well. This is that piece as it lands on the campus next to the library and the core design studios. But enough of architecture, let's speak of community. I want to conclude with one more project. It's a collection of related pro bono endeavors. We believe in the agency of the built environment to shape community, and specifically in the power of art to influence perception and engagement and patterns of use. And incidentally, actually, this project, as well as the bridge, both received National AIA Urban and Regional Planning Awards. So it's funny that they both happened in the same year as well. They're so different, but they share some of the same spirit. And it's upon this principle that together with a host of collaborators, Payette built a nonprofit entity in an underprivileged city just north of Boston. And this group called Beyond Walls, it aligns its arts initiatives with the strategic goals of its community partners to improve these places where we live and work and play. They engage the local stakeholders, both in defining the problem as well as in developing the solution. And this approach very rapidly delivered successes in communities like Lynn, where this constellation of urban improvements changed the character of the city. We enhanced walkability with repurposed vintage neon signs that pull pedestrians through the downtown commercial area from one destination to the next. And over 100 murals done incrementally over a series of annual mural festivals. They elevate the stories of the community, saying, we are here, our stories are worth telling. This rail line cuts straight through the center of downtown Lynn, and it produces a series of dark underpasses, which are areas of increased crime and vehicle pedestrian accidents. And the community said, we need better lighting in these underpasses. And we said, let's take it one step farther. Let's make it epic. And we did, from rendering to executed work. On these community-led projects, it is vital that we as designers are not coming to the table with the solution in hand. Instead, as I see it, my role is to provide an injection of energy and expertise at just the right time to catalyze the efforts of these community stakeholders. And then the pandemic hit, and it changed everything. But one of the opportunities that was embedded in the challenges of the pandemic was this reclamation of outdoor public space for public use. What was a parking spot serving just a single private vehicle might instead be converted into a public amenity that serves dozens, and it provides ancillary benefits for local businesses and public health and wellness. WASH came out of a prompt actually from the Lynn Community Health Center. And they said at-risk populations, particularly the homeless, they no longer have ready access to hand washing because the restaurants and businesses, they were all closed. And so it was impossible to do this via conventional means. We couldn't just purchase the products because all of the off-the-shelf portable wash stations were on back order. So we quickly cobbled together a working prototype from an old irrigation tank and bilge pump. We did a couple of these, and then we refined the project and the product using digital fabrication and assembly labor from paid students at the local vocational high school. And after a few more iterations, it became a rather lovely object. It's a piece which says this community is deserving of well-crafted public amenities built by people who live in this neighborhood. And so the business community and the public officials saw the success of WASH, and they thought, we need something like this to support outdoor dining. And so Fold was born. These are kind of almost metal origami, they're cut and scored on a laser cutter and then bent by hand into position and screwed in place. Now, this conversation about mixed use or pedestrian-centric streetscapes, it's long been cited in planning studies, but it is immensely challenging to muster the political will to execute these interventions. So in this light, I am keen to capitalize on our current momentum to deliver fast, attainable, meaningful change. And perhaps more importantly, I want to pioneer a process that is replicable across numerous communities. The key thing here is the engagement of the end users in the development and the execution of the initiatives. A successful project is one where the community it serves feels a sense of authorship and ownership in the work. We've got a few fun things cooking. I'm not even going to tell you about these projects. We'll see in a year or two. But as we all know, the pandemic, it disproportionately impacted groups that were already disadvantaged. It's highlighted the inequities that are codified in the built environment, particularly with respect to wealth, race, and gender. And so in this light, I've begun to think about public shared space as the key battleground for combating this built injustice. And it's not just about public work. With every project, we must ask ourselves, how can we build in amenities that serve a broader community beyond the bounds of the project brief? As an architect, I think our charge is to provide design that is inspirational without being prescriptive, and to approach the design process with an openness and a kind of humility that invites many voices to contribute. What is your role in a story that is bigger than you? Thank you for listening. I'd invite any questions you might have at this time.
Thank you, Parke. That was really, really inspiring. And I'm sure we have a number of questions from the group. And as Elizabeth said at the beginning, please either feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions, or if you feel more comfortable, you can put it in the chat and or raise your hand. Patrick?
Thanks, Parke. That was fantastic. I love what you're doing and the leadership you're providing. It was great to see your work. You mentioned a couple of times the challenge we have in the way our industry is structured between architects wandering into fabrication, which is the responsibility of a subcontractor or a manufacturer, or wandering into means and methods for which our liability insurance doesn't cover us. I'm wondering about your thoughts in how the AIA and BSA might be able to help with new types of contracts so that we understand how we're going to be compensated if we do a full-scale mock-up. We understand how to communicate the value of doing those things, that we are able to advise about means and methods without incurring the liability. Do you have some thoughts about how we could change contract structure and how BSA can help with that?
That's actually a wonderful prompt, Patrick. And I share your interest in this. I mean, if anything, as you see in my own work, the area where I feel most comfortable in some respects is in this dialogue between the designer and the specialty subcontractors. I mean, that's where the really special moments of the project frequently transpire. And you're right, there's no contractual structure. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They say, you have no contractual relationship. And actually, if you go talk to that guy, you're incurring risk. So proceed at your own risk on this kind of thing. I think you're right. We need to have, and it can't be just a straight up integrated delivery model kind of thing. I like the idea of this shared agency where autonomy is maintained, but you've got some kind of collective vision. It's a different kind of contract, and I haven't seen it. I think that's a project for you and me.
Yeah, I think we also need to educate owners, because owners are so focused on the outcome that they don't understand that encouraging collaboration, pre-qualifying preferred subcontractors, these kinds of things don't reduce the ability to bid and get the best price. They actually improve the schedule and improve the price. But I don't think most owners understand that very clearly from what I've seen.
No, and maybe the onus is a little bit on us as architects to say, hey, let's show you how to do it. We found, while not every project was immediately a success from a financial vantage, long term, we're able to, kind of move forward without incurring huge financial risk by making models that are not getting paid for out of the client's budget, because it makes the decisions happen quicker. Now, that said, it's clearly a value-added service, which is deserving of compensation. So you're right. How do you educate the client to do that? Is it just a differentiator that says we can do things our competitors cannot? It shouldn't be. It should be part and parcel to the way that buildings are constructed. There's an obvious value. We've proven it time and time again. Thank you, Patrick.
David Eisen, you have a question?
Yeah, and just kind of a comment. I was a little bit late because I'm on the Massachusetts School Building Authority Designer Selection Panel, and we were interviewing and reviewing submissions for public schools. And the process not only makes it hard to do what you're doing, it makes it impossible because it's baked into not local, but state regulations. And the idea is to avoid corruption. Maybe it keeps the worst from happening, it keeps the best from happening. And I wish, and maybe there's a way to pass on you and your presentation to the people who are involved in institutionalizing a process that makes this virtually impossible, because everybody would be sympathetic. There's no one who wouldn't say, fantastic, but far removed is what the legislature sets up. So I don't have so much a question. I mean, the question isn't so much for you, but maybe a question I will address to the MSBA. Are there any thoughts about how to make this easier? Because public schools are exactly the kind of place it would be great to see this kind of collaborative relationship between designers and producers and users.
Yeah, David, you and I are kindred spirits in that respect. And I think the most we can do is to communicate, that the risks are less than they are perceived to be, and the values are far greater than we ever might hope. And if we can do that by showing the projects that have already been executed in similar ways, not all of every project, but pieces of many projects, I'd hope we could incrementally move that dial. A lot of the projects I'm thinking about, the architectural projects, not the discrete projects, are 20-year projects, whether it's about shifting demographics within the profession, new contractual structures so that we can do more beautiful and more effective work. These are long-term things, but I've got plenty of time.
So in this presentation, is this available? Is there a link that can be passed on? Any of us could grab?
I'll let Patricia speak to that, but it's my understanding that it will be processed and then posted publicly by the BSA.
Thanks.
And I'd welcome follow-up conversations as well, David, once you share that, and I'll drop my contact info here as well, my email, and feel free, anyone, with other comments to share. I'd really love to continue the conversation.
For those that may not see the chat, the video will be posted shortly. This is being recorded, and actually you can look on the website and see last year's recipient as well. And our goal is to eventually accumulate a number of different catalogs of these types of videos. Another question from the Solomon Foundation.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I'm a little bit of the outsider at this table. I think I run a foundation.
Herb, you're never an outsider. Herb is not an outsider anywhere he goes.
Yeah. I run a small foundation, and we've been active in Lynn and in particular and elsewhere. And I'm fascinated by this. I really share this notion of shared agency, where autonomy is maintained. I keep on coming back to that phrase that you used, Parke. And I'm a landscape architect by training, though I'm running a foundation now. And I've encountered a lot of skepticism towards professionalism of any type when you work in communities. And I think there's a healthy skepticism there. And so, and I see the sophistication of the work you do. It's hard for the average person to even begin to understand the modeling and the technical know-how that you bring to the table. And yet, you're asking them to participate in the fabrication and on that journey. I'd just love you to talk to that. How do you work with folks from the neighborhoods and build that trust and bridge that gap of technical knowledge? Starting out, I imagine there is some skepticism. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one, it's about understanding the capabilities of your allies. I mean, there's a reason we use high school students from the local vocational high school. They already had some of the aptitudes. They definitely had the interest, which was the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And then and now I'm thinking specifically about, say, wash and fold, some of the pandemic era projects, mm-hmm. which, were public, real. They weren't just a study for a day. You build a chair and you take it home. This is going in the public built environment. It's got to be robust, mm-hmm. and at a certain level. And we brought, 17-year-olds in to do this kind of work with us. And so, the parameters for success were tightly bounded. We knew what it was we're trying to achieve. That's a good thing to kind of have at the beginning. What are the metrics of success? That way, if you've done it or not. Mm-hmm. And kind of the opportunities for failure were minimized. The parts are cut exactly right. You put it in the right place. The screw goes into the hole and into the other things. It takes some time. It takes a little bit of craft, but in all likelihood, you will do it well. Mm-hmm. And so that is the kind of circumstance which I think proves the validity of the concept. Now, it would be very easy to do it badly if the problem statement is ill-defined, or if it's too easy or too challenging. And so I think that needs to be calibrated really carefully on every specific project with an understanding of, here are the current constraints, here are the aspirations, and here are the people that we have at the table.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Herb. Look forward to future work together.
Marty, you had a question?
Yeah, Parke, it's great to see this, and I applaud your demonstration of this idea of shared agency. And it was interesting that it immediately led to the idea of contracts. And contracts are agreements where it's an agreement where if the other party doesn't uphold their end of the contract, then it authorizes you to terminate your end of the contract. But there's an agreement that's higher than a contract, and that's a covenant. And this idea of shared agency is that the designer has a covenant with the community, and the covenant imposes a responsibility. And so it's not like a contract, because a covenant doesn't mean that if the other side drops their end of the bargain, that you get to drop yours. You act in the benefit of the relationship between the two parties. So what you're doing is you're upholding your end of a covenant between the designer and the community in a very admirable way that can't be written into a contract. So I applaud you for that.
That's a lovely way to think about it, Marty. Yeah, thank you. The nice thing about a contract ultimately is that it's just a written record of a shared understanding. And so even if this is the way things have been structured in the past, I feel pretty comfortable saying there's opportunities to structure them differently, to speak to Patrick's point earlier. And I do see this as an opportunity where a group like the BSA, where we've got a massive wealth of, combined skill sets, and kind of the weight of many powerful voices, that's the vehicle for driving this type of change at that level. It's certainly something I've already done with some of my knowledge community collaborators, some of whom are on this call. We've got BSA knowledge community groups that have as their members not just architects, but those in allied professions, we call them, the guys with shops, the facade fabricators, the specialty metals guys, the woodworkers, and the custom mill workers. We're in the same meeting together, and we go tour each other's shops, and we talk about things like CNC router feeds and speeds. And so finding those kind of opportunities for common territory, that's how you build community, and that's how you continue to improve the way that we do the things that we do.
Mark, you had a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Parke, for really awesome presentation. Really appreciate it. I guess I wanted to ask a little bit. I mean, I'm approaching this partly from fabrication, but also from an education standpoint, and thinking about how we teach about these things. And a lot of people go to school, fabrication is very common in architecture school. You learn about all these things. Everyone comes out, wants to build a bunch of stuff. I did that myself for a number of years. And one of the things I ran into when we were talking about contracts and liability is one of the first projects I did when I went to go install, I was in a building and they were like, you need to have insurance to drive in the parking lot in case you ding a car. You need to have another insurance when you go through the hallways of the common spaces. So in case you ding a wall, then you need to have insurance to work in the space. And as a recent grad, I was like, what is all this? How do I deal with this? And this stuff is never taught as part of your fabrication curriculum or your architecture curriculum in school. And it's not something I think a lot of architects even think about too much. It's something that's kind of in the realm of the contractor, subcontractor, all those kind of things. So I'm just curious about how do you think that we need to sort of think about these things from an education standpoint, because so many people are so passionate about fabrication. And I feel like as soon as they graduate, then it's really hard to find a path through that. A lot of people go to either traditional practice or they go into pure fabrication, but it's really hard to find a kind of hybrid kind of model of these things. So I'm just curious how you think about that and what your thoughts are on that particular topic.
Yeah, that's an awesome one, Mark. And you and I have similar experiences. I think I've been exactly there as well. I think it's an inevitable growing pain. Yeah, Hike and others on the call as well. Yeah, there's a huge gap. I mean, we're doing this kind of, educating for irrelevance, which is a terribly, it's a disservice to the next generation of architects. And that's not true across the board, but there are significant gaps, which don't allow for recent graduates to either be meaningful, engaged immediately as they enter even a traditional workplace. But certainly it doesn't kind of arm one with the skills to navigate less trammeled territory like this, fabricator architect thing that some of us are trying to do. I'm increasingly interested in academia. Over the last year, we did a studio that we hosted, a Virginia Tech studio here in our Boston office at Payette. I've been on a series of reviews. I'll be at Northeastern tomorrow. How we educate the folks who are coming up behind us. I mean, these will be our colleagues. These will be the folks that are, really pushing the agendas that we're trying to kind of predispose. We can't even really own it unless we are instruments of their advancement. And so I love the idea of saying, yeah, it might not seem relevant right now, but here are the things you might want to have on your radar. And I think part of that is it's a really heavy lift for academics who haven't practiced for significant years to then teach people how to practice. You teach people to be academics if that's what you know. And that's not at all a criticism. It's simply an observation. And so I like the idea of increasing connections between practitioners and academia. I think there's actually a lot of value to be had for everybody that's part of that exchange. And it is an exchange. There's a reciprocity. When I go to a design crit, I get something out of it as well. And that's why I go. And those conversations are invigorating and they change the way I think. And I almost like to foreground that when I talk with the students here. I'm not here to just help your project, giving freely of myself. You're also giving to me. The same is true of the pro bono work. There is a reciprocity inherent in every one of these engagements. And what it does is it kind of eliminates this power dynamic, which says, I am giving to you, therefore you must be beholden to me. Let's take that off the table. We're working together and we're going to do incredible work. Thanks, Mark. Stay tuned. I got some plans for the academic thing.
Let me know if you ever want to chat. I'm up for it.
Absolutely.
I'll chime in a little bit here as a segue from what Mark brought up. Great presentation, Parke. It was very inspiring to watch and listen to you. So we're kind of, I'm speaking from Jaywalk Studio. We're sort of a small outfit of designers and fabricators, and we kind of blend the line between those two things. And when Mark brought up the topic of insurance in their first few projects, when those things come up where it's like, oh, you need general liability, and then you also need workers' comp to work here, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's one of those things like in high school, let's say, they don't teach you about personal finance. It's one of those things that you either learn at home or you learn as you go, and that's part of the process. And for us, like when we started Jaywalk, it was a lot of those things started to happen where you're like, you learn as you go and you adjust and you add new things to the business. And that's the same for, on the sales side of things or the accounting side of things and all the things that make up a business and all the facets of it. But I'm gonna leave this presentation feeling inspired and looking forward to the projects that we have going on and approaching them with some of the things that you brought up and talked about. So thanks, Parke.
Oh, thank you, man. And if it's any consolation, those kinds of learning while doing on the fly, it's like we're experiencing the same thing right here, right now at Payette. We're a large, well-established firm with a whole bunch of really capable people, and we're doing things differently. And anytime you do things differently, specifically over the next year, you're going to see us increasingly building really key special moments within our projects. At what point does that still fit under our normal architectural deliverables? At what point does it transcend the boundaries of our contractual kind of constraints and our liability insurance and go into something else? And we're still figuring that out. And it actually, as I've seen in other conversations, it's different for each specific entity and their risk profile and the kinds of work they're trying to do. We're able to draw some kind of clean lines by saying, we will fabricate, we'll design, we'll fabricate, we'll own the objects, we'll give the objects to the general contractor, and they'll screw it into the wall. And that's where we're dividing, we're putting the line right now. But I could see that continuing to evolve, particularly as the scale of the work and our engagement grows. So that's another one where it's like, let's see where it is in 3 years. I think we might have a different conversation then. But I love the idea that there's enough of us doing this kind of thing that we're talking about a new mode of operation. And with it should come with it a whole bunch of different relationships, which are to the betterment of the projects.
Parke, I'll jump in quick.
Thanks,
A
Peter.
lot of this is the importance of design build, whether it's educational spaces or practice, right? And communication, empathy. We are also starting to approach new ways of simulation, of communicating, right? Virtual environments. And how does that play a role in this? And also my question is, do you have any concerns about that? Now, there is a great benefit to us being able to communicate not only locally, but also globally with these things. Do you have any concerns about where we're moving forward?
Well, I mean, here at Payette, the visualization team, I've got my little fabrication crew and we make some stuff, but really we're just, the tip of the spear, and we're supported by a whole bunch of individuals across the project teams that are really doing the bulk of the work. Same is true with the visualization, and that's kind of a very analogous. It's not even a formal department so much, my group, but it's, a facet of our studio. And so we've got visualization and we've got fabrication, and together we're specialists in this kind of thing. And so visualization might take the mock-up that I make and use a AR apparatus to project extra information on top of it. Candidly, Peter, I'm not sure I'm going to take the bait. I don't see the problems. I see the opportunities here. I'm a little bit agnostic. I like the message. I'm kind of agnostic about the medium. And if the right tool for this job is a VR experience, that's what we should do. It's the cheapest mock-up I ever made. It's like, that's that. So there's a time and a place for each of these devices, and having the agility to bounce between them and say, hey, I'm going to use this for this and that for that, actually is really important if we're trying to communicate with an audience. Because if we always use our same exact mechanisms, how is that going to land with different audiences, with different priorities, experiences, and kind of preconceived notions of what it is they want? So, I would say more and more on all fronts.
Thanks. I tend to agree on most everything. Maybe not 100%, but on most everything I agree. I think failure still has a place within specifically academic and learning experiences. But yes, thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Peter. Like I said, I've got my email in the chat, and I'd encourage those of you who think of something later today or on the drive home or later this week and say, I'd like to talk that through, and I would like to talk it through also. So look me up and let's have that conversation. I intentionally kept this presentation within something that could be consumed before everybody's brain cells kind of wore out. If we end early, I think that would be a testament to each of our kind of abilities in this particular arena.
Are there any other last questions for Parke? Well, I think this has been a great presentation. Definitely gave everybody a lot of inspiration and things to think about. And we do want to just encourage others to consider applying for the Flansburgh Award. The deadline is May 27th, and I know in the chat there is a link to more information about it. But definitely, as Parke has opened the door, feel free to reach out to him if you have questions about the process. But thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Parke. This is a great presentation.
Thank you, Reagan. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tricia. Thank you each of you for being here today.
Yeah. Thank you.